Welcome to episode 1 of Elite Muscle Radio, Tyler and mine's new podcast. Today, there's a chance that we've peaked at episode 1 and it'll be all downhill from here. But we have Broderick Chavez with us, the evil genius himself. We always think to say that he needs no introduction, but in the UK and in the bodybuilding world, I do feel like he goes a little bit under the radar. Probably one, because he wants to, and two, a lot of his work is done sort of in the background or in the shadows, working with people that are probably not allowed to say they're associated with him.
Very true.
But he is one of the smartest people I know when it comes to performance enhancing drugs and sort of everything surrounding bodybuilding, sports performance. I'll let him introduce himself a little bit, even though he doesn't like to talk about himself. So welcome, Broderick, and thank you for coming on.
Matt, Tyler, thank you. Listeners, as they said, B. Chavez, proper name is Broderick, but B is typically the nomenclature. Saves people a little bit of tongue twister. As you can tell by the accent, I am, or the lack of, as I think of it, I am in fact American. I very much love the UK and the UK macabre of bodybuilding and strength sports. So it's a shame that I'm not more involved in the UK scene. I don't like a biography is kind of hard because, to be fair, as Matt said, an awful lot of it is under the radar. But short answer, really capsule version is lifelong bodybuilder, powerlifter, in both athlete and enthusiast. I started as a bodybuilder in my tens, tweens, I guess. Moved up to very, very competitive bodybuilder in the US in my teens. Through that, I don't want to say I was a savant, but I was good enough to garner the attention of some very smart people. And fortunately, I was smart enough and dedicated, interested in the intellectual side enough that they were able to just sort of drag me along intellectually, and impressed upon me the need for education, constant learning, which, to be fair, I think I had that in me somewhere. So as my physique improved, my knowledge, my lack of knowledge became more apparent, which then drove me to learn more. And at some point, my intellectual abilities very much outpaced my physical abilities. By the time I got to university, I was taking a break, as douchey as that is. I was taking a break from bodybuilding, looking at eyeing maybe a transition into powerlifting, which I was ultimately very much better at. And because of that kind of transition, I did a little bit of coaching at the university I went to, and that really launched me down the whole university higher education path. Not that I pursued into master's degrees and PhDs, which I did not, but what it did was illustrate to me, which ultimately everything is about me, not like I'm the center of the universe. It's like I need to be aware of it before it can really happen. Like, it made me aware that my real abilities, my real gift, I hadn't limited gifts in bodybuilding, moderate gifts in powerlifting, but my really forefront sort of genetic gift, if you will, was that to behave sort of as a Rosetta Stone, in that I could go to the field, go to the gym, go to the, wherever, communicate with the athletes and speak in a bro enough language that I could understand what they were talking about. I could then circle the problems. Okay, they're having a problem with this, this, and this. Their language, would be bulking and explosiveness and these other goofy terms. And then I would go into the university itself and be able to communicate with the white coats in a language that they could understand, and say, we're having a problem with myofibril cross bridging, and we're having a problem with neurological conductivity. And so I could sort of be this interpreter between the actual athletes, and I had enough athletic acumen to be accepted by them, and then I could communicate with the actual white coats because I had enough intellectual acumen to communicate with them. And again, this is a very self-serving thing, and I don't exactly mean it the way it sounds, but it made me very much more important than I really was. And so it gave me a unique spot to just kind of exist. And I was never the center of attention, but I was always just between the 2 points of center attention. And it's been a very good place to live, and it's given me the opportunity to be around and work with literally the best athletes on earth, learn an enormous amount. Unfortunately, the biggest thing I've learned and I don't joke, this is a frightening thing. I just had a birthday. In 40 years of doing this, the biggest thing I've learned is how much I don't fucking know. So that's a capsule summary of who I am.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that sort of originally drew me to you was that ability to just be that conduit between, because you can get, there's a lot of people in this game that are super super smart, but then you
Absolutely.
just look. I mean, I'm not a moron. Um, I'm pretty intelligent, but when someone's talking in just technical terms and you just glaze over and think, I don't know what you're saying to me. It's almost like trying to have a conversation with Sheldon Cooper, and he doesn't realize that you're not on this level. But that
Yeah.
ability to take something that's super complex and just, I mean, Tyler says it all the time that if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, like give up, or you don't,
Yep.
or you can only really hang around with your own peers. Um, like bodybuilders are not the smartest creatures. But I think that ability just break very complex topics down so we understand them. And I think it's helping me become a better bodybuilder, a better coach. And I think that's what you offer to the world is.
That's my goal. That's my desire. And to be fair, and I point this out a lot, and I don't know, I don't think it puts me in a good light, certainly not as a person, but it is true. Um, I just had somebody the other day. I was at the Mr. Olympia 2023 Olympia in Orlando, and somebody said something to the effect of, like, well, it's clear you love to help people, and I stopped and I said, no. No, you're totally misunderstanding. You're misinterpreting the situation. The truth is, with rare exceptions of my true inner circle of friends, I don't give any fucks about any of these people. The efforts I go to are quite literally selfish. I actually look at a person as an opportunity for me to practice and learn how to deliver this information in hopes that I will find some spot that I fail at, and then I will circle that and I'll go back and study. So this like, oh, clearly you want to help people. It's no, I use used is probably the proper word. Every single person as a test subject to measure my knowledge and improve my knowledge base. At the end of it all, I guess I do help the people. So I guess there's that. But it's funny how people immediately kind of turn it around and make it like, well, clearly you're a good guy. Like, no, not really. Like, not so much. Anyway, but on that point, for you two gentlemen, I will do my damnedest. So, what's on the docket for the day?
So we want to sort of obviously when we look at like you said the bros or whatever, one of the first thing, well, the main thing is always comes about drugs. And obviously,
Sure.
you being the drug guy, I think people are still very much, even though there is more education, there's a lot more information. People are still very much sort of stuck in this like, what's the best drug for bulking? What's the there's specific ones that just cover that. So we'd like to discuss what when someone's looking to do a course, whether it's their first, their 10th, their 20th,
Mhm.
what are the questions that they should be asking themselves,
Sure.
and how should they go about choosing or selecting the drugs for
Okay.
themselves?
Well, all right. I'm going to apologize in advance because this beginning is going to require a little bit of monologue, and it's also going to require me answering some questions you didn't ask. So,
Mhm.
the first thing I would say is the first thing I would say is you yourself, Matt, use the correct term. But I would say the first thing you need to do is change the general vernacular. People will say, I'm going to do a cycle. But right away, that's the thing that needs to change. I know this sounds to the average person, this sounds very childish and pedantic, but it's very real. And it's real because I'm starting with it because it's going to be the refrain from for the rest of the conversation. And that is you must choose the correct word so that the label, the heading, the title on the title of the chapter when you get to the book reflects what's going to be on the coming pages. So rather than cycle, the first thing we need to do is look up that word and say cycle. It's repetitive. It's a circle. It goes back to the beginning. Bicycle, unicycle, weather cycle. It's all talking about the cycle of the seasons. It's all you go back to the beginning. I can't envision a reason why you would spend money, break the law, and risk your health to go back to the beginning. Why would you do all of those things to go from 90 kilos back to 90 kilos? Like that doesn't seem a rational thing. So what I propose right out of the gate is we change that word to course. And then if we look up the word course, we realize it's a route to a new place. You have an origin where you are, and you have a destination where you want to go. And it just that suddenly changes everything. I'm 90 kilos and I want to go to 95 kilos. Now, take any course. We were just talking about traveling around the world. Any course requires some logistics, like a fucking map. And if you had a map and you look at here and you look at there, you might see roadblocks, things, mountains, rivers, whatever that you need to navigate around. I'm going to take this route instead of that route because there's traffic on this route. So such and such. So with a map, you could then begin to see obvious avenues and problematic areas. And then with that, you could maybe open up, in the case of physical travel, you'd open some sort of travel book and start, oh, well, in the evenings, this is hard, or in the evenings, this is easy. You start to see patterns and ways to navigate these things. I suggest we do exactly that in the world of sports. So we have an origin and a destination. There's going to be problems along that route. Whether if it's bodybuilding, you may say from the beginning, my biggest problem is it's hard to eat, or I have a problem and I eat too much, or I heavily convert to estrogen and I always have estrogenic problems, or I don't. And you just sort of make a list of things that will go wrong, things that you think will go right. And now all of a sudden you have a fucking map. Now it's just a matter of choosing the vehicle that's going to help you navigate that course. So now it comes down to change cycle to course, origin to destination, identify the obvious problems and the obvious advantages, and then you go to the big book of drugs, whether it's physically a book or a website or myself or any other expert, and that resource, you then choose the best tools for the job. So this idea of what's the best this for that, it really depends on the context of what's that. Any steroid in the world, and by the way, PEDs covers a pantheon of drugs well beyond steroids, but any steroid in the world, even the crappiest one, will build muscle. You take enough Proforin, you'll grow some muscle. The worst steroid in the world works. So now it's simply a matter of they all work. Which one's going to work the most harmonious with the conditions that I've set out? It's like, again, like travel. You may have a fucking 100, 200-pound, 200,000-pound race car that goes, fast. But if you're taking all your gym buddies, that's a terrible tool. On the other hand, if you have a school bus and it's just you going to the local mart, that's a terrible tool. So it's not a matter of what's the best answer. It's the matter of what's the best answer for these conditions. So that's just a change of mindset based on language and logic. But once you get to that stage, it becomes very much easier. So if you kind of take all that metaphoric travel nonsense away and you implement this, you have a blank piece of paper and you say, all right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to design a cycle. And then you go, okay, scratch that. I'm going to make a course. And you say, I'm here. And here might be anything. I'll use this example. Here is beginning of off season. I just competed. I'm doing this for the next course off season. So I'm here. So off season, I have a body weight, a body fat percentage, things that I need to fix based on the assessment of what happened back there. So I was on stage and they told me, your quads aren't big enough, your rear delts need, and so you have this list of shit you want, a position, a body weight, a body fat, this stuff, maybe some rider injuries, maybe some rider conditions. You say, well, I have a new baby, or I have a new injury, or I have a new thing that's going to control, certain investments of time and effort. And then you move over to plan to fix those things. In other words, plot the fucking course. So you look at like what's going on in the future and you say, well, I have 16 weeks of uninterrupted time. So right away, pow, 16 weeks of time. Awesome. And then you say, well, these are the body parts they told me I need to improve. So you retool your training, regardless of whether you're high volume, low volume, or whatever you are, you prioritize those things. I know we haven't talked about drug one yet, but trust me, it's coming. But drugs fix problems. You have to identify the fucking problems. It's not just, oh, DECA makes you big. Yeah, you have a big swollen head, perhaps. It's a matter of what you need to do. So you start creating this, I'm going to prioritize quads, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. And then you look at that and you say, all right, what will that take? Myself, I would propose a relatively high volume approach that will have certain requirements. But let's say you're not that guy. Let's say you're one of these Mike Mentzer assholes, and you're going to do it with effort. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying it's not the way I would do it. But the point is, if you're going to be training very low volume, very high effort, very low total area under curve, less sets, that's going to the training is going to look different, the nutrition is going to look different, and then the farm is going to look different to support that. Whereas if you're doing it in 10 sets of 10 in a high bar squat, that's going to have entirely different requirements. So it's sort of like people will say, like, what's the best drug to bulk? My first response would be, what's the best exercise to build your quads? Well, if you look like Tom Platz, it's going to be high bar squats. If you look like Lee Haney, it's fucking not going to be high bar squats. So how can the best thing be two different things? Because it's contextual to the person. So that's the sort of logic tree you need to build, is this, what am I doing? Where am I at to start doing it? What is the actual mechanics of getting to the gym? How much cardio? Again, and I mentioned like body weight, body fat. Like, let's say one of the things on that list is, I know historically I come into off season too lean or too fat or in great physical cardiovascular condition or not. That's going to then modulate how much input of cardio. So there's all these various levels. Let's say you go into an off season and the number one problem you have is you run out of runway with appetite. It's 3, 4, 6 weeks into it, you just don't want to eat anymore. That's going to be a problem. And that's going to be in one of those obstacles on the course that you need to circle. And it's one of the obstacles that you then need to get the big book of drugs and make sure, one, each of the drugs you input, like I'll come back to that thought, but each one of the drugs you input, make sure it doesn't exaggerate that problem. For instance, Anadrol. Everybody knows Anadrol, it's a big drug. It's a bulking drug. It's also a really bad appetite drug. So if you go into things knowing you have an appetite problem and you're swallowing Anadrol like Tic Tacs, you're going to have an appetite problem sooner. That's probably bad. So it's this logic tree. And then even after you get the logic tree, like for instance, go back to the workout thing, because I think most people have more practical knowledge on working out, on weight training than they do drugs, but all of the logic applies. Let's say bench press. Let's say that you need to bring up your pecs and you think the best tool is bench press. Cool. So you put that in there. But then you go down a little bit further and you realize every time I really get aggressive with the bench press, my shoulder training suffers. So now is it worth using that exercise to maybe bring up your pecs, probably bring up your pecs, but probably inhibit, maybe even damage your shoulder growth? So now you look at that, and there are certain conditions where you go, yes, that's a fair trade. If my shoulders are amazing, my pecs are not, I definitely go pecs. But if your shoulders are on the cusp of like they're not bad, but they could be better, and you're doing a thing that's definitely not going to make them better, that could be a problem. So even though you a lot of times when you put this flow chart or logic tree of right tool for the right job, the the truly best tool for the job isn't actually the right tool for the job because you might have to go down to the second or third choice. They're lesser, but they might be a better fit. Do you see that? Like there's where most people go wrong. They immediately think the best thing is the best thing. That's not the way it works in the real world. Again, go back to like that buying a car. I said, you have a school bus and a race car. Well, maybe those are the two best tools, but maybe you can only afford one. So you buy a fucking minivan. If you close your eyes, you can pretend it's a little sporty, but you can also get some extra assholes in the back. That's the sort of thinking that you need to go through this. So a long kind of bloviated, route to get to the logic of how you do this. So now you've got this sort of concept of how you make these decisions. That's going to bring you full circle back to something that I actually want to be very clear and say this out loud. Something that I am credited or dare I even say blamed for, which is the family tree of androgens. I did not.
Sorry, just continue. I've got 4 minutes left, so I've got to upgrade Zoom. I didn't realize. I just have to get my credit card. Carry on.
I did not create that particular thing. I very much did refine it and popularize it. But as I mentioned in the very beginning with the introduction, I had the very good fortune of being welcomed into the fold by real movers and shakers, real intellects of the industry. And because of that, I had the absolute privilege of being associated with people like Dan Duchesne. And I had the opportunity, I was very young. If I remember correctly, I was 15 years old, and I was in the presence of Dan Duchesne at this odd little food stand type scenario, a little outdoor eating thing in Santa Monica, California. And at the time, I didn't even know who the other part of the conversation was, but I was waiting patiently to speak with Dan. Dan was having a conversation with this other individual who turned out to be Mike Zampano, a name that's kind of lost to time in the fitness world, but late 70s, early 80s, he was the real deal. Went on to be a bit of a supplement mogul in the U.S. over that period. Anyway, they were talking about steroids, and Dan said something to the effect of, well, they're all absolutely related. It's a big family, but the parent is definitely testosterone. Just an innocuous remark, something that Dan was very famous for doing, just saying a really relevant sort of world-changing thing, just casually in the corner of a conversation. That stuck in my craw. That really dug in, and I really grabbed that, and I started creating this very elaborate family tree. But I must confess that the idea was well in advance, out there in the world from Dan. He just thought it was so sort of obvious and apparent that he didn't take the time to make cool little graphics showing us all because he was that sort of guy. He just assumed everybody knew that. Well, they didn't. I went to the trouble of formalizing it. So, yes, I did that, but do understand that's not my idea. However, if you understand that idea, which I'll explain now, it then gives you a very solid you tool to apply to your mapping of all of this. So the idea is like a family tree of genetics. If you go on, ancestry.com or whatever, you start putting people in lineage or historical families. And interestingly, or perhaps obviously, the patriarch of every family, and matriarch for that matter, if they're, redheaded or dwarfs or very, very tall or, coal black or any of the things that people can be, weirdly, you find those characteristics turning up in all of the downstream relations. If the patriarch is, 6 foot tall and redheaded, you're going to find that over and over in the children and grandchildren and so on. So the idea was you take testosterone and you break it into its sort of obvious children. Testosterone is a parent, patriarch. Directly under that are immediate siblings, his children. So testosterone then gives you dianabol, turinabol, boldenone, a couple of others, but they are directly, you can see the exact family relation to. If you move laterally, testosterone could have a child 19 nor testosterone or nandrolone. It's testosterone with a minor alteration. It's different. It's not testosterone, but every one of their children is going to be very nandrolone-like. Nandrolone, trenbolone, ment, Nilvar. All of those drugs are very, very similar in structure and coincidentally behavior to nandrolone. Move the other direction, another child would be DHT. It's a minor alteration from testosterone, but it's clearly its own thing. It's a child. And from DHT, you can get Primabol, Masteron, Anavar, Winstrol, a host of others. So if you start to then understand the parents, we know vaguely what testosterone does. Testosterone is an androgen that literally means in Latin Greek to make male. It is the drug largely responsible for male characteristics. Makes little boys into small, and then later perhaps much larger men. It is the masculinizing drug. A 10-year-old boy and a 10-year-old girl look almost identical. The difference is the input of testosterone and or estrogen. So it is the male making drug. Now, admittedly, with becoming male comes a certain amount of muscle mass. So I'm not arguing that it isn't anabolic or it isn't good for sports or any of those things. I'm saying, what's its job? Then you move over to nandrolone. You look at what its job is. It's not a masculinizing drug. It's not there for the purpose of turning little boys into men. It has a different purpose. If you root through medical books and things to find that purpose, you find it's actually related mostly to pregnancy. Not super relevant to this conversation, but the thing you find mostly is you get more anabolic action per unit milligram and more body weight per unit milligram. If you apply equal amounts of testosterone and nandrolone, you'll almost universally get more body weight. Not always is that body weight muscle, but you get fullness, roundness, water retention, all of these things that result in the kind of, again, if you use the conduit method and you go, if a bunch of gym idiots say that, things like size, I hear volume. And then I go to the lab people and I say, they want a drug that's going to volumize, give them more area per unit milligram. I would hear nandrolone go. So that's the sort of conversation. So that 19 nor category, you get a different variety of estrogen and a lot more volume per unit milligram. The middle column, you get masculine traits and also sort of kind of a funny word to use in a conversation about drug use, but natural results. In that, what would happen in the real world in survival? If a creature were stressed, it would make testosterone because it doesn't have the ability to make synthetic anabolic steroids. So it would make testosterone. That's very survival driven, athletic, if you will. Fight or flight. Can you run away? Can you recover from the running away to run away the next day? Can you forage for food? So it's sort of that athletic stuff, red blood cells, just general day-to-day recovery that lives in that middle column. Move over to the DHT column, direct relative of testosterone, much, much less body weight per unit milligram. Largely, if you look at where DHT happens, if you will, in male evolution, it's midlife and beyond. More and more testosterone starts being converted into DHT for the reason of actually bringing down your body weight while maintaining the ability to survive. Because nature has figured out that as you age, shit wears out, like your heart and your liver and your kidneys. So if we slowly lower the body weight, there's less burden on those things. But if we lowered testosterone, you would become useless. So nature figured out if we start converting testosterone to DHT, we can still have the aggression and ability and function of survival, but at a lower and lower body weight to actually extend life. So now we've got this parent that's by design a little lighter, but maybe a little stronger. From that, we could then make prima balamasteron, etc. So once you sort of understand the flow chart of what lives in each column, now it gets a little easier to do your shopping. When you come up to I'm designing a course and it's all about being big, my first thought is, well, I'm going to be over here in this nandrolone column. Once you get over there, then you start to have to look at the secondary consequences. There's some blood pressure that lives in there. There's some, bloating, there's some functionality. So even though that's like immediate your first choice, it may either be you need to go to your second choice or limit the amount of your first choice in terms of amount of drugs. For instance, just as an example with this column, there's almost always, and I say almost always because was not always the case, but most people would now have some input of that center column, some TRT, HRT, sports TRT, a backbone, if you will, of testosterone. And by the way, that's a really new thing, really new being 2000. Prior to 2000, there were loads of bodybuilders and athletes worldwide that did not use testosterone much at all, if at all. I find it comical. I'm going to go off the rails a little bit here, but I find it comical just coming back from the Arnold or from the Olympia that everybody pines for this classical Arnold-like physique. But the first drug everybody grabs is testosterone, the very thing that Arnold did not use at fucking all during his competitive career. I find that really funny that everybody wants to paint a Picasso, but nobody wants to use the paints the Picasso used. I find that really fucking weird. Maybe that's just me being clever, but it seems pretty obvious to me. Anyway, back to the subject at hand. So most people have that center backbone of testosterone. So the way I would look at it, and again, in this design concept, is a milligram to kilogram ratio, where we I don't really like the word ratio, but a sort of a number. Either you've never done drugs before and I could give you some good starting points, or you can come to me and say, well, the last time I did and you rattle off some stuff, I added up. And I go, all right, you at the end of that course weighed 100 kilos and you took about 1.2 grams of drugs, just generically drugs. So I would divide that out and I say, all right, you went to a peak dose of 12 milligrams per kilogram. So then I would then plug that into our new equation. 16 weeks. At the midpoint, I would say around week 8 or 9, we'll hit that 1.2. Obviously, that means there's going to be an inclination on the front end, and then we're going to have a steady state on the back end. That's how I'm going to arrive at that number. If you had never done drugs before, I would look at your age, race, sex, body weight, history of the sport, and I would make my best guess. So plug that number in. Then we decide what the testosterone backbone, if you will, input is. Let's say it's going to be 3 milligrams per kilogram. So we have this 100-kilo athlete, so there's 300 milligrams of testosterone straight across. So week maybe 1 and 2 is nothing but, because that's the inclination. And then we layer in the next necessary tool. We're not going to raise the testosterone because it's there to do what it's there to do. That's the masculine. You're not training for porn. You're training for sports. So you only need so much man, so many boners. That's under control. So we plug that in. Now, it's possible that we missed the mark and we have to make an adjustment, but you also have to abide by things like fucking logic and reason and past experience, shit like that. So it's pretty much worldwide experience. And 3 milligrams per kilogram is going to get you your HRT type effects. You plug that in. The next layer is the next most important thing. Depending on who you are and what roadblocks you face, you're a little skinny, wiry dude that needs volume, or the bro science size. I need size. Well, size lives in the 19-Nor family. So we're going to input size a la nandrolone. So we come in with 200 milligrams of nandrolone. And then maybe a week or two later, maybe 100 or 2 milligrams more. So we've got this inclining dosage with the most relevant tool. But let's say when we went down that flow chart, we also realized that, hi, my boy. Hold on.
Hey,
You are
no,
yes.
this is all
You're
good.
interrupting. You're interrupting
Any
my
dog can interrupt.
So let's say when we were making that list, one of the other things we knew, and I'll give you like two examples. Let's say example one is you notoriously have a problem with estrogen at some point. So we're inputting nandrolone and about half of the total milligrams to our peak. In the case of this conversation, that will be like it was something in the total of 600, 700 milligrams testosterone plus nandrolone. We're concerned we might start getting an estrogen problem. So instead of just raising the nandrolone ad infinitum, finding the estrogen problem that we know is lurking there, and then just start swallowing, a Arimidex or whatever the thing is, maybe we just cap the nandrolone at about the midpoint of the escalation. Then we come in with a either non-estrogenic drug, let's say primobolan, or a blatantly anti-estrogenic drug like Masteron. So we testosterone, nandrolone, we cap out on what we think is rational with the nandrolone, but it's the lion's share of our milligrams, so it's doing the bulk of the work. It's sort of the bench press in the chest workout, but most people don't just bench press it and run. They bench press and then they do some flies and some machines and some things. So that extra layer of milligrams, we go with either pro or neutral estrogen, say Primobolan Masteron, in this conversation. And then we top out the milligrams, we hit steady state, we continue. Now, I also want to emphasize this. You started this conversation with, you're the drug guy. And admittedly, I've fallen into that role. But really, at my core and at my education, and my core match very well. I'm lucky in that way. I find a lot of people pursued educations that aren't really what their internals are for. And there's sort of a little bit of a conflict at their core level. I do not have that. I am exactly the way I think, and that is a biologist. So even though we're talking drugs, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking drugs are just another part of training, nutrition, behavior, overarching everything. I don't believe you can just be a biologist and just study dietary habits of humans, because you have to look at where do they live? Why are they doing that? Who is their surroundings? What are the tools they have to forage, to cook, to etc.? That's the way I look at drugs and any other part of it. So now you've got this escalating milligrams, steady state. That means that then your nutrition should do something. And it also means your training volume should do something. And so all of this shit needs to layer together. And it also then means your cardiovascular training should do something, because your training volumes are escalating with milligrams. It's possible that your cardio actually declines because you're training more and more. You can't just train everything more and more. Even with drugs, the bottom falls out of that. So as training volumes are going up, calories are going up. But all while that maybe cardio, either intensity or total volume, is going down. So you've got all these things that need to fit together like puzzle pieces. Like the yin and yang actually forms a circle, but if you look internally, it's actually not. It's two teardrop pieces that happen to form a circle. That's the sort of thing we're doing, is looking to get these pieces to fit in such a way that there's no conflicts. What I find in modern drug use is just conflict after conflict, and the conflict is resolved with an even worse decision. I just keep pushing the testosterone up until my titties hurt. Then I swallow Arimidex. Then I get fucking floppy dick, and then I take fucking Cialis, and then I have blood pressure problems, and then I do this thing, and then I can't sleep, and I take a sleeping pill, and then I can't wake up, and I take fucking amphetamines, and before it's done, you're taking 47 fucking drugs where all you needed to do was avoid the fucking conflict.
So well, I think that's sorry. Obviously something me and Tyler have spoken about recently, the whole sort of the new hair falling out finasteride crowd that blocking their DHT. And that is a question I did want. The drugs that are derived from the DHT,
yes,
they can't reverse back to
100%.
DHT, can they?
Right.
So the things that give you the DHT sides, is that the conversion from testosterone, or is it certain DHT derivatives?
Here's the reality to that. And it's going to be very unfulfilling as an answer, but I have limited imagination to make up lies. So what you get is exactly the truth as I know it. And that is, the textbook answer is clearly not correct. What is correct, we don't know. In standard human biology, non-exogenous drugs, there is an enzyme produced in the liver called 5-alpha reductase. If you draw out testosterone, it's these four sort of hexagons, and they're numbered the 5 position. This enzyme does exactly what it says. It finds the 5 position, reduces it, making the molecule unstable. The way the molecule stabilizes itself is by attracting an additional hydrogen. You wind up with testosterone with 2 hydrogens, aka dihydrotestosterone. Dihydrotestosterone is both wildly more anabolic and also, sadly, wildly more androgenic. It binds to hair follicles all over the body, but mostly in the scalp, and causes hair loss. So the textbook answer would be create a steroid that cannot be reduced. You have no problem. So if you synthetically reduce it, aka make a DHT derived drug in the lab, it cannot revert back to DHT because it's already broken. You can't re-break a thing. It should not do that. The problem is, in the real world, everyone who's ever taken Priambol, Masteron, Anavar, Winstrol finds that one of those gives them some hair loss. So the truth is, textbooks say it shouldn't happen. Real world says it does. We do not know why. Everybody I've talked to has a theory and a suspicion, but none of them really seem to satisfy the real world scenario. If you look go to Wikipedia, please do this, listener. Go to Wikipedia and type in Primaball, and you get a little picture of it, the little 4 hexagons, and then type in Masteron. It's like playing Where's Waldo to try and find out which one's which. It's literally just one little bar and one little. The difference is tiny, yet every single person here will take Priambon. They either will or will not have a hair loss problem. Take Masteron, they will or will not. It's not universally this one or that one. I've met people that have taken Masteron every course for 20 years. Because of their age or whatever, they're like, I'll dumb it down. I'll take Priambol, and it's a little more mild. Literally, one shot, their hair falls out. Like literally, like cancer patients. Well, what the fuck? It doesn't make any sense. So, as much as we know, and as much as I'm an expert, unfortunately, the reality is we know a lot less than there is. There's a lot going on here that we don't understand. And then the conversation gets even weirder when you move over to, say, nandrolone, drugs like nandrolone decoinate or trenbolone, because they're already pre-modified from testosterone to 19-nor testosterone. When they 5-alpha reduce, they actually 5-alpha reduce into 19-nor dihydrotestosterone, which is a different animal yet. And very few people really understand what that means, myself included. I could draw it on a napkin. I can tell you, it does this. But what that means out in the wild, it's very, very poorly understood. So all of this conversation about prostate growth and hair loss seems to be both drug specific and, sadly, individual specific, which doesn't make it super helpful. But at least knowing that the bullshit, Masteron causes hair loss. No.
Yeah.
Or yes.
I think
again, that's the problem.
I think obviously the acne seems very sort of down the same, whereas there isn't of this causes that. I mean,
100%.
I've never suffered with acne at all on any course except my very first one. I got acne when I just used testosterone, and I got acne when I finished.
Yes, that's very common. That's very, very common.
But it's never happened since. Probably because I never stopped the drugs after that. But yeah, the first time.
I will sprinkle in a couple things about acne specifically. First thing, like yourself, I never had it. I never got drug-driven acne. Actually, I never really got acne of any flavor, even as a teen. So things that were not very important to me were not very important intellectually. So it's not a topic that I studied very hard because it just wasn't a thing to me. However, there's a very current trend of sunlight. Everything's sunlight. Diurnal, get a morning sun, go out and rub your feet in the sun, rub your ass on the grass, all this. That, as much as a huge swath of that annoys me, I will say, and I keep I wave them all the time at the camera. I keep little notebooks by my desk I just write down things when I think it's an interesting idea, statistic, whatever. I write it down, and I will say universally, since the exaggeration of go outside and get some sun, aka pretty much COVID, when COVID hit and sun became important, or not seeing the sun became important, sun exposure went up, acne went down. Universally, I can tell you that I have 100 examples in notebooks. As sun exposure went up, regardless of drug use, regardless of past history, regardless. More sun, less acne. I just find that interesting. It's almost like we were missing the boat.
It would artificial. Oh well, would sunbeds do the same? Because I've always said to people, you tanning seems to
100%.
prevent or
And
help that.
My immediate response to that would be probably yes, but probably not as well. There's very few examples of things like that. Now, it's funny because I'm going to contradict that when I talk about steroids, but there's very few things where the original isn't the better. You know what I mean? The idea that we're going to cook up a better sun in a laboratory than nature put in the sky, that's a stretch. Now, can we take testosterone, which is the original, and make it better? The answer is better at stuff. Like, can we make it better at turning little boys into grown men? Probably not. But could we then tweak it to make it better at expressing force or modulating body weight or some specific thing? Yes. It's like penicillin. Think about that. Think for a minute. Penicillin is a wonder drug. And every single antibiotic works the same way. They work the way penicillin works. It retards bacterial growth. It binds to a receptor and retards bacteria's ability to reproduce. That's what penicillin does. Yet, if you break open a nursing manual, we have 100 varieties of antibiotics. Why? It's because tiny little nuances make one family better for dental infections and one family better for renal infections and one family better for skin infections, even though they're so similar and they do the same thing. The little nuance, that carbon junction, that 5-alpha reduction, that whatever makes it a little better at something. And in sports, it's that little better that makes you fucking better. The difference between first, second, and third at the Olympics is a fucking decimal point. So that's where we have to look. So just remember that, just because it's the original doesn't make it better, but also when you've come across the sort of original, think about what it's supposed to do. What's its job? And then how can we get children off of that tree? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think
It's not fair.
going
You
back to
guys
the
have heard
acne.
my song and dance before.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I say, does that make sense? I'm actually talking to the audience and where they're not here. So
Yeah.
I'm an
I
idiot.
was
I
about to say,
apologize.
it's rare I don't talk very often, but when you're speaking, Broderick, it's usually when I'm not talking. So I have to apologize for that. I listened to all this 3-4 times because I think it's invaluable for everybody to listen to.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you. But
with
so
the talking about the acne thing as well, you can sort of see it. When you look at sort of stereotypical demographics, especially in American stuff, when you have like the California kids that are tanned and good looking, and then you have the spotty kid that's in his bedroom listening to music, and the goth type no tan, and you can sort of see it if you actually look around where there's those examples of how sort of sunlight will or can alter that.
yeah, and it's interesting because it's hard to know where one line ends and another begins. For instance, if you roll back time a little bit to say the 1960s, America's a great example. You had the West Coast bodybuilders that were in the sun because there's sun. Sort of not like it's sort of what's the chicken and what's the egg. They all migrated to California. Was it because of the sun, or was it because somebody or someone was doing something there? But the end result is, and it was sunny, and the weather was nice, so they spent time outside, so they were tan. So you can't really draw the line at which instigated which. But then if you flip the script and look at the East Coast, it was more of an indoor environment. It was warm 4 months a year, no tans, less time outside, therefore less cardio, therefore, and you start to look, even the physiques themselves started to take on a different look because the behavior took on a different look. And so I really, really believe there's a lot to that in terms of not just the drugs, but the environment in itself. Sort of one, it's hard to tell is it the dog wagging the tail or the tail wagging the dog kind of thing. I find that sort of conversation and that sort of mental exercise is very interesting. Something that I also pointed out in a different podcast that isn't maybe directly related to this one, but it's sort of overarching with this concept of behavior in the late 80s to basically today, kind of before the Chinese UGL thing just exploded. You found that physiques had a geographic look. German bodybuilders just sort of looked away. UK bodybuilders just sort of looked away. And then you went to the US and it was different yet. And most of that difference I found was local drug availability. If you looked at the drugs that were available to German bodybuilders, it was testosterone, deca, anadrol. And then you look at their bodybuilders, you're like, holy shit, yes, that's exactly what that looks like. Just big for big's sake, and just kind of. Then you went to the UK and it was a little more sophisticated, but different yet. Then you went to the US and there was a lot more GH, probably because there was a lot more money. And so the physiques kind of tracked the choices, which I think is the wrong way around, but it did seem to be that way.
Yeah. So, reverting back to the family tree and someone trying to build a course,
Sure.
I think in an ideal world, starting from the beginning, your dosages would be the effective dose and then progress onwards.
Well,
However,
actually, let me pause you there. There's this kind of universal idea, and I blame sort of the Mike Menser type mindset that the only way things happen is progressive overload. And people take that crazy, and I think they apply it to their milligrams as well. Last course, I did 1,000 milligrams. This course, I have to do 1,200. Next course, I have to do
don't
14.
necessarily mean that, because you could choose a drug that maybe was a little more powerful at the same milligram and the same milligram per kilogram, but your body weight
Correct.
would.
But consider this. Let's say you were a strength athlete. Let's say you were a power lifter, and you squatted fucking 400 kilos in your last contest. You don't start your next training cycle at 400 kilos. You start wildly below that and progressively increase, hopefully to the 405. Milligrams work very similar. So even though maybe last course you went to 1,200 milligrams, you're definitely going to start at whatever your base sort of untrained, you start your 5x5 for that 800, that 400 kilo squat. You start that down at 250 for 5 sets of 5, and you add. Now, admittedly, those first couple of weeks are so easy. You're almost like, wait, am I wasting my time? But 3-4 weeks into it, you realize, no, I wasn't. I was just getting ready. So milligrams are going to be very similar. So it's not a matter of minimum effective dose or any of those things. It's sort of like calories. If you're eating this many calories, one more or one less is exactly that. People always like I'm going to put arbitrarily insert a 500 calorie deficit. I'm like, why not 50? 50 is less. Now, 50 won't be less for long. So every couple of days, you need to debit 50 more and 50 more. But that saved you 450 calories worth of anguish on day one. Milligrams should be the same. So if your TRT is 200, an escalation to 300, although nominal, is still a fucking escalation. Take it, enjoy it, utilize it, then escalate to 400 and so on. More steps. And the weird thing is, as a biologist, you start to realize everything in every single fucking demographic of your life, every single segment is the same. As a parent, we homeschool. So I dive in like the intellectual asshole that I am and study everything I can find about how to teach children. the number one thing you find, which by the way, completely violates everything that public schools do the world around, is the more stops and starts, the better your retention. You, in learning, the first thing and the last thing are the most ingrained. So if you stop and start a lot, you have more bookmarks of quality. So instead of reading an entire chapter, you read a page, then you talk about it. You read a page and you talk about it. The more stops and starts, the better. Meaning smaller increments seem to be better absorbed. This applies to everything. Tanning. You don't just go, oh, I'm going to get a tan. You go out for 8 fucking hours and burn yourself to fucking death. You go out for an amount that may almost be useless. And then the next day, a little more. And the next day, a little more. Small increments to the point where you don't notice it happening. It just happens. It turns out that applies to everything. You have calluses on your hand from a barbell. Think about that asshole that's like, I'm going to lift weights and go to the gym and has a giant workout and his hands are bloody. Incremental, small steps to the point where you don't even notice it, which also ties into something I point out all the time. I'll oftentimes recommend a drug like, say, Primobolan, not because I have a love affair with Primobolan, but it's sort of one of those drugs that if you give me a list of problems, it solves a lot of them. So it's the answer a lot of times. I hear people say something like this. Oh, I that time I tried Primobolan. I gave it an honest try, and I didn't feel like it was working. What the fuck does muscle growth feel like? How do you? I have a pretty good body awareness. I do not know what protein expression feels like. That's one of the most retarded, insane things I've ever heard come out of the face of a fucking semi-human. That's absurd. I didn't feel like it's what they meant to say was I didn't get a raging hard on. My face didn't turn beet red. And I didn't act like a dick. So clearly, So just remember, you're not supposed to feel it. You're supposed to, at the end, be at the destination. That's the goal. You have an origin, you have a destination. The goal is to transmit yourself to that point, not some magical experience along the way. That's important.
I'll try and rephrase the question. Perhaps somebody that early on they made a lot of mistakes, and let's say
Sure.
this second or third course they took 5 grams.
Okay.
And then someone says, look, that's far too many drugs. You can go back to the. A lot of people believe, well, I've already done that, so I can't take the steps
Absolutely
backwards. And how would you go about explaining to them so they can
Very
sort of
easy.
make peace with that?
Very easy. Think about this. Whether you want to believe it or not, there is many supports, like a teepee, holding up this vessel. Think like a witch's cauldron, and that's you, the athlete. And then there's all of these legs supporting it. Imagine if you, for some reason, you didn't have a number of supports. You would just have to have one really big one. That's how most people treat drug use. They sit their pot on drugs, and then they just find to make the pot bigger, I must make the drug post bigger and bigger and bigger, like a mailbox on a support. So if you want to make that one smaller, you must introduce others. So to reduce milligrammage, you must either introduce non-milligram drugs. So maybe take steroids out, add peptides. That's a perfectly solid possibility. Less anabolics, more growth hormone and insulin to spread out the load, if you will. Perhaps the reason the drug support is so big is because they don't have lifestyle support. Maybe they need more rest, more sleep, better nutrition. So as you start taking away milligrams, you must replace it with something positive. Or vice versa. As you lose positives, you must add milligrams. It's not a coincidence that contest prep becomes the time bodybuilders use the most milligrams. It's because they are losing those other supports. They're overtraining. They're doing more cardio. They're under eating. They're losing sleep because of all these other things. So as all those other things go away, something must support the vessel. It becomes drugs. You can apply exactly the opposite logic and unravel the drug post and support it with other things. Better lifestyle, better environment, better nutrition, additional non-anabolic drugs. And so you just start spreading out the load, getting a bigger and bigger base without it just being Anadrol. That makes sense?
Yeah. I'm probably going to use the wrong word, but can you waste drugs in terms of taking far too many that only a certain amount will cover muscle building, and then you're just
100%.
taking so many milligrams that you're just almost, it's pointless?
Well, of course. There's a number of problems with that conversation. One, it requires a little couple, 2-3 minute speech. And then the punchline is you still want to do that anyway, sort of. Okay. Imagine, and this is sort of biology 101. I'm not being an ass, but this is something that people basically should have garnered from junior high school, life science, junior high school. There's a thing called biological and or chemical signaling. The best metaphor for it I can offer you is an elevator. You walk into a hotel or an apartment building or some such, and there's the double doors. There's a button. Okay. The first thing you need to understand is that button does not make the elevator come. That button signals, quite literally, it's just an electrical signal that activates complicated machinery that you cannot see and do not understand. So you walk up and push that button, electric goes somewhere and shit turns on, and there's levers and cables and clutches and things that slowly move this elevator to where you want it. Okay, so that's the concept. The button nor your finger makes the elevator come. It signals the elevator to come. So that's the metaphor we're going to use as an elevator. So now the things you need to make this perfect is, one, when an elevator comes, you can only go one floor at a time. So you get in, you go up one floor, you get off, process begins again. Two, the button is pressure sensitive. And every single floor up the building, it's a little bit more pressure required to signal the elevator. Progressive overload. So that's the then kind of game. Elevator, pressure sensitive, one floor at a time. That's pretty much it. Right out of the gate, before you even touch this, the amount of time, intellectually, the amount of time it's going to take for the elevator to come is really about how far away is it. If it's one floor away, you're going to get one pretty quick because it doesn't have much distance to travel. If it's a 100-floor story building and it's at the 99th floor, you're standing around tapping your foot a little bit. Okay. So in the beginning, the first time you walk up to push the button, you might have a significant wait till anything actually happens. That's important. Very metaphorical to a course. That's interesting. And then once you get in, get off, it's close because you just saw it. It was right there. So it's going to come quicker each repetitive time. That's interesting. A lot like a course works. Very slow progress in the beginning. All the progress seems to be at the end because the elevator is never getting very far away from you. That's interesting. So now you walk up with your finger and you push the button. You know that the button's pressure sensitive, and natural, whether it's truly without drugs or at a TRT, it doesn't matter. They're essentially the same thing. At this sort of poverty milligrams, you occasionally get an elevator. So you can kind of sense what the pressure sensitivity is. It's somewhere around 200 milligrams because that's what you're fucking taking. So if you start at 300, you're taking too much, but nominally. So you push the button with your 200 or 300, you get an elevator, you go up a floor. You push it with your 300, you go up a floor. But every floor is more, and you didn't start with a huge margin. So at 3 or 4 floors, you go to 400. You always outpace or take a little too much, but only a little too much. Can you fuck this up? Can you get the numbers wrong? Yes. But let me give you the alternative. Okay. So let's say over the course of 16 weeks, you go a couple 100 milligram jumps here and there to always outpace it. And you wind up at the 50th floor and you find, oh, fuck, I'm taking 1.2 grams. All right. Not ideal. Drugs are bad, but you got to the destination. Cool. Now let's run your twin brother, who's a little drunk, been in a bar all night. He walks up to the other elevator in the hotel and he just pushes the button as hard as he fucking can with 1,200 milligrams. And he gets an elevator and he's like, oh, I'm fucking smart. And he goes up another floor and he does it again, another floor. And on about the 20th, 30th floor, what he's got is a really sore fucking finger because he's been pushing as hard as he can. And that's cool in this drunken brother example. But unfortunately, in the steroid world, it's not your finger, that's your liver, your heart, and every fucking thing else you've got because you've been pushing way too hard to get the same fucking elevator.
That's right. I think some people think that if they do push so hard, well, I'm going to just get bigger and I'll get more muscle. But as there's only, I guess, so much chemical signaling you can do at any given time.
Exactly. Again, with the elevator analogy, like, what are you going to do? Get in the elevator and go to the moon? Like, it only goes where it goes.
Yeah.
Now, something else you mentioned earlier, I'm not trying to lead the conversation, but something you said earlier about, kind of unraveling milligrams into other support structures. One of those would be growth hormone.
Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that, but I've got an army of dogs going absolutely mental.
Hey, no, can't hear it, Matt. That's all good.
Can you hear it?
No.
I don't know if you want to go down the little rabbit hole that is growth hormone, but hi, my wife. Okay. Ooh. Sorry. You probably don't need to know this, but what happened is a euphemism for an erection happened. Yeah. So anyway, now that everyone's uncomfortable, we just passingly mentioned, oh, well, that might be a place where growth hormone comes into the conversation. Probably don't have the time to go down the entire, rabbit hole of peptides, but real quickly, growth hormone has gotten very much cheaper than the 90s when it was sort of an elitist thing. And it's a great way to introduce anabolic support. And I put little quotations around anabolic because it actually does a whole lot more than that. That is not, I don't want to say it's
continue. I'm just going to go sort these out. Sorry.
I don't want to mislead and say that there's no risk. There is different risk. You're diverting away from the sort of cardiovascular and maybe liver issues that anabolic steroids might bring, and you're spreading it out into sort of blood pressure and renal and maybe insulin sensitivity. But it's a way to not just keep layering the same problem on top of the same problem. I don't know. This is kind of a corny thing to say because I don't want to dramatize or glamorize drug use. But the neat thing about growth hormone is it's very much a multifaceted tool. It is a viable tool in the I want more muscle, I want to be leaner, and I want to repair injuries. It's a valid tool in all of those categories, whereas anabolic steroids maybe are not. So that's interesting. Sort of the way, not sort of blatantly, the way you use it, how you implement it will bias what it does. So it becomes a very, universal and multifaceted tool. I don't want to also glamorize it like, like I'm under my breath going like everyone should be taking growth hormone. It's not exactly what I mean. Maybe it is, but I don't really want to be responsible for saying that out loud. But I think that if you can access and afford it, it's a very high utility tool.
I know your concept. I don't know if it is your concept. I imagine it is, Broderick. I definitely learned it from you and I've took it forward ever since. But just briefly what you touched on about, pre-bed being more muscle bias and then, early AM being more fat loss bias is just something that's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, the first thing before that conversation, you really need a very thumbnail of what the fuck this hormone does. And by the way, I think you need that, you, the listener out there, you need that for every hormone. And don't hang on my every word. Go do some research, Wikipedia, buy a book, anything just to get a sense of it.
Can I just buy
Please.
the Team Evil GSP ebook, the AAS handbook? It is, I think I actually reference it maybe once a day. Like if a client messages me, and it is, I now call it the Bible. I used to call William Llewellyn's anabolics book that, but this is very succinct, bites. It doesn't confuse you, and to the point where, again, you need to be a biologist to understand these drugs. It is a very, very good reference. So the Team Evil GSP website.
I appreciate that. And by the way, I go way out of my way not to fucking be a commercial whore. I come on here to talk to you. I come on here to talk to you guys and, you know, offer some information. I try not to make it a commercial thing, but thank you. So real quick, you should have a thumbnail of every hormone. You know, when you start talking about, and just name your thing, insulin, thyroid, whatever. Like, yes, you need to understand the drugs and how to implement them. But I don't think you can actually understand that until you actually understand what the process is. You know, how many people will say like, oh yeah, thyroid's a fat loss drug, speeds up your metabolism. I'm like, cool. How? Where? Like, give me something. That's pretty vague. And most people don't have the something. And so I don't really think you can make the best choices if you don't understand the vague process. So, vague process. Growth hormone is phenomenally complicated. This is literally the idiot's guide. Okay. When growth hormone enters your bloodstream, whether your brain made it, actually it's more like back here, but whether your brain made it or you bought it in a bottle. And by the way, or you took a secretagogue or an MK or a whatever, the answer is, and now growth hormone enters the bloodstream. Okay. It circulates through the bloodstream. It goes everywhere. That is most important. People don't realize when you take a drug for your foot. It doesn't like go down your neck and run to your feet. It goes everywhere. When it gets to the thing it's meant to do, it has action, but it goes everywhere. So that's important. So growth hormone enters the bloodstream and goes everywhere. Quite counterintuitive, it doesn't do growth. Its first line of action is everything but growth. When it's going everywhere, it communicates with whatever's there, where there is. So when it gets to, say, the pancreas, it communicates with the pancreas and convinces the pancreas to release glucagon and lipase. Probably other hormones as well, but those are the two big players. And glucagon and lipase enter the bloodstream and do what they do, which is glucagon goes to the liver and to a lesser degree muscles and asks it to contribute glucose to the bloodstream. So blood sugar is going up. Lipase circulates everywhere, goes to fat cells, or not goes to, that's bad language. When it encounters fat cells, because it goes everywhere. When it encounters fat cells, it convinces them to contribute free fatty acids to the bloodstream. So now you've got an environment where glucose is going up, blood fat is going up, circle those, energy. Available energy is going up. The body only contributes energy if it thinks something energy intensive is about to happen. That's quirky. Okay. So it's liberating energy to do something. Meanwhile, growth hormone's in the background and it finds muscle cells. Well, it communicates with muscle cells, not growth, but it says growth might be coming. So get ready. So muscle cells orient in such a way that satellite cells and stem cells and all these mechanisms and structures that are going to potentially do growth wake up, turn on, activate, whatever language you want to use. It's not growth, but it's sort of the priming for growth. So now we've got energy, we've got a readiness. Now growth hormone's been circulating the bloodstream, gets to the liver. The liver takes growth hormone, says we have growth hormone, and it does some sort of calculation that science truly is aware of, but doesn't understand the details of. And in this calculation, the liver measures blood glucose, blood fat, inflammation, androgens, estrogen, thyroid, probably a bunch of shit we're not even aware of. And it puts all of those values into an equation and then says, make this much IGF-1. So the messaging hormone comes, the calculation is done, then IGF-1 comes out the back of the liver, it circulates, and what does it find? It finds primed, ready muscle cells that are ready to grow, and it's the key to unlock that growth. When it does, the muscle cells then find blood saturated with energy. So it's a perfect circle to get to that point. But it's important you understand that series of events because that explains a bunch of things. For instance, one, why your waking fasted glucose might be higher on growth hormone. It's because you took growth hormone, numbnuts. It's because growth hormone does that. It releases glucagon, which talks to the liver, which puts glucose in the bloodstream for growth. If you took growth hormone and didn't see an elevation in blood glucose, it means one, wasn't growth hormone, or two, if it was, you're not going to fucking grow because energy is required to grow. So right away, shit starts to fall in fucking place. Now, if you understand that series of events, a problem arises or a potential problem. Again, origin, destination, obstacles. The major obstacle in that series of events, you. You are capable of fucking up that series of events. Let's say you take the growth hormone, it releases the thing, it does some stuff, and then you jump on a treadmill and start burning up energy. All of that energy that the body took effort to put in the bloodstream, you're now vectoring off, you're diverting it off to turn a treadmill. That's going to interrupt the growth. What it will do, though, is burn fat because your body went to the trouble of dumping fat into the bloodstream. So now you can treadmill it away. It's like the government putting money into the economy, but it not getting where it was meant to go. It goes to this other thing. You can do that. So if you took growth hormone first thing in the morning, before eating, before all that, and then hopped on a treadmill, you would be burning up the energy that the growth hormone put it in the bloodstream in the form of fat. It's a very good deal if you're trying to get lean. But know that by doing that, you're going to have less available energy to actually do the growth. Some, but less. Now, let's say you move it 180 degrees and you take the growth hormone right before bed when you're not involved. You're asleep. You're not going to fuck up the works. All of the energy goes to the growth, but it doesn't go to the fat loss. So you've got this where you use it and how you use it. And more importantly, the behavior around when you use it is going to dictate the outcomes. It's not a coincidence that every parent has ever said to their children, shit, I think you're bigger. You grew in your sleep. No shit. That's when you grow because you're not running and frolicking and jumping and playing and burning up that energy. The only time when you're stable and non-intrusive enough to grow is when you're asleep. It's why the brain is wired to release the growth hormone at sleep. The body doesn't, nature doesn't make an arbitrary decision like, I think I'll have all these humans just do growth hormone at 10 p.m. Like that's sure. There's a reason why. It's because that's when you're still. That's when you're immobile. That's when you're not fucking up the process. You see how easy this? I say easy. It's complicated. It took me 40 years to piece all this shit together. I don't want to lie and be like, oh, it's simple. Everybody should know it. But once it's illustrated to you, it should be very, very succinct. So, same amount of growth hormone. There's always some fat loss, always some growth. The closer to bedtime, the more you're biasing the growth, minimizing the fat loss. The earlier in the day, the more you're biasing fat loss, minimizing the growth. Also, long, complicated, probably don't have time for it in this conversation, but the window of action is such that you can get most of both. Not 100%, but for instance, if you did a bolus first thing in the morning, did the cardio, and then one before bed, they might not be quite as good as in isolation, but good enough that it's better than the total effect. Which is why you find pros with essentially unlimited budgets oftentimes have an AM, PM, sometimes even AM workout and PM environment, because there is enough time for that process to actually run full cycle before you initiate it again.
What would you say that time is? What would you leave between a dose?
All right. There is a time course of many different varieties. Growth hormone hits your bloodstream. Something almost instantly, that first stuff happens that circulates the bloodstream, talks to the pancreas, releases the thing. So almost instantly, you're getting that escalation in blood glucose. Okay. So how quickly to get on the treadmill after taking the drug, it's kind of like just go, get going. Okay. You've got about a 60 to 90 minute window before that whole gets to the liver, starts producing IGF-1. Very few people are doing more than 90 minutes of cardio. So that, again, kind of just works. Get up, get on the treadmill, do your 30 to 60, get off, the magic happens. At that point, circulating IGF-1 has a very short lifespan. Okay. Once it binds to binding globulins, different conversation. But circulating IGF-1 has perhaps as little as a 30-minute window. So short answer is this is about a 2-hour process front to back. The refresh rate, if you will, depends on whether you are natural or not. Meaning, if you did all that with no exogenous growth hormone, your body produces a protein. Well, whether you took growth hormone or not, your body produces a protein called somatostatin. Okay. Somatostatin actually suppresses your body's ability to make more growth hormone. So if you were not using exogenous drugs, if you were natural, there's going to be a suppressive window to keep you from doing that again. That is about 4 hours from the initiation of the thing. So if you fall asleep, your body makes growth hormone. About 4 hours, your body's not going to make more because this somatostatin protein is going to be in circulation. It dies in about 4 hours. Coincidentally, most people sleep, 6 to 8 hours. So the process inhibits itself, but the inhibition wears off about the time you wake up and you can go again. So there's that. So trying, if you have these like little manuals that say like, oh, saunas and massage and ice baths and all these things release growth hormone. No, if you've already done it. That's a button. Again, the elevator, that's a button. You have to go up a floor and get off. You can't just keep riding the elevator for fucking ever. So if you've had a significant growth hormone event, you got a 4-hour window till you get another. Full stop. Now, if you can buy growth hormone in a bottle and just input whatever the fuck you want, every 2 hours that process is complete, you basically can go again. Just know, like everything, hookers, lawyers, guns, everything, more tends to make more problems somewhere. That, and your personal risk reward, your personal budget, your personal whatever, if you're okay with the cost, have at it.
What can a bodybuilder do if I know you said we don't really understand the calculation, but what can a bodybuilder do to the liver create more or the maximum amount of IGF?
That's I'm not trying to dodge you. I'm not in the slightest, but I would say that is a very complicated conversation. What I can tell you, and I really don't even like to say this in public conversations because it sounds a lot more like I'm endorsing spastic, shotgun drug approach than I mean. But we do know that calculation involves androgens, estrogen, insulin, and thyroid. Almost certainly others, but we know those. We also know that when you get to this part of the conversation, you're probably taking the androgens. Insulin's elevated, if not from exogenous use, from sheer food volume. The two that seem to be the most ignored in this conversation are the estrogen and the thyroid. So if you're at that stage where you've input steroids, got a result. You've inputted growth hormone, you've got a result. You've inputted insulin, you've got a result. It's probably not just keep cranking the dial on those. It's probably what do you need to bring up to those levels to get the most out of those? The two obvious are estrogen and thyroid. So looking at whether you could tolerate a little more insulin, estrogen, that's probably blood work powered. And also, have you sort of, I don't like to say ignored because it makes it sound like I just think you should just keep taking drugs. But most people, thyroid is distant on their off-season thoughts. It's usually, that's a fat burning thing, I'll take it at contest time. I don't, again, I don't want to make this sound like just keep inputting drugs, but I'll give me as an example. I'm an expert. I'm the one of the smartest guys in the field, whatever, blather my accolades. I've also made some awesome mistakes. One of them is I have been throughout my career mostly less drugs is better. The least amount of drugs you could take, not necessarily in dosage, but like say in variety. The less the less palette of drugs, probably the better off you are. And because of that, I made exactly the same mistake I'm illustrating. I really said, no, I don't need thyroid. Thyroid's for fat people. Like no. And what happened is as my body weight got higher and higher, I started out in this world bodybuilding, competing in bodybuilding in 130s, then 140s. Like I started as a very small human. Off season, 165 pounds kind of thing. I peaked out under drug intervention. I peaked out at almost 250 pounds. 112 kilos. Okay. Unfortunately, my thyroid had to adapt to those bigger and bigger and bigger body weights, basically with more and more output. So I forced my thyroid to just keep adjusting to a bigger and bigger body weight without giving it any support, if you will. And I did to my thyroid what a little fat kid does to their pancreas. You just keep eating more donuts, and the pancreas has to keep pumping out more insulin until it breaks. Unfortunately, my thyroid broke. So since mid-30s, I've been thyroid dependent for the wrong reason, because I avoided thyroid thinking I was doing a good thing when in fact I actually wasn't. So again, I don't want to make it sound like the more drugs you take, the better off you are, but I do want to point out that every action has consequences, and you need to look ahead at those consequences. It's likely that had I input thyroid, one, I would have preserved some thyroid function. I probably would still be where I am, but maybe at 45 instead of 35. And two, I might have gotten a bit more synergy from my growth hormone and my things, rather than trying to be the Scrooge that I was and, like tough it out.
Yeah. One of the other things you mentioned there was about the short lifespan of IGF.
Correct.
You said with binding globulins that can change. Could you just
All right. Well, that also requires just a little bit of conversation, as well as a confession as to my age. Actually, over the Olympia weekend, I had a birthday. I'm 52. I don't say that as a brag. I say that as perspective. When I went to university, all of the language was different. Growth hormone was actually not called growth hormone. I don't joke. Growth hormone was referred to as somatropic hormone, STH. You don't hear that language anymore, but it's true. Please go back behind me and verify. And what we now refer to as IGF-1 was referred to as sometimidin C. There was actually a fleet of sometimidins. We've renamed, I didn't have shit to do with it. They renamed all of them to insulin-like growth factors. They were always growth factors, referred to as sometimidins, A through I don't even know what, but C was the one we refer to as IGF-1. The reason the name was changed, this is important. The growth hormone, I don't actually know why they changed that name, but the sometimidins changed to IGF-1 or insulin-like growth factors because it was learned that they share the insulin binding protein. So when insulin binding protein is in your bloodstream, insulin can obviously bind to it. That's what you would expect, insulin to bind to insulin binding protein, but also IGF-1 can bind to it. Okay. So because they share a common binding protein, it seemed sensible to give them commonality of name. So that's why that name was changed. The important part there is one, that insulin and IGF-1 share a binding protein. And then secondly, an explanation of what a binding protein is. So first, the second, what a binding protein is essentially a time release mechanism. Everyone in this conversation will have some vague understanding. Whether they understand the mechanism or not isn't super important. They will understand that, say, testosterone suspension, or I think what now is referred to as base. I don't know where that came from, but since the dawn of time that I'm aware of, it was referred to as suspension. Testosterone suspended in water is very fast acting. And then if you add an ester, propionate, cypionate, enanthate, etc., the time release gets longer and longer. Okay. Basically, insulin in its native form is the suspension. And when it binds to a binding protein, that's like metaphorically like adding an ester. It now has a measure of time release. It's going to hang out in the bloodstream longer and not get metabolized. Okay. Why this becomes relevant, that the binding protein is a time release mechanism and that insulin and IGF-1 share, is you run this process, growth hormone, pancreas, sugar to the bloodstream. One of the consequences is going to be insulin goes up. One of the consequences of that is the liver is going to go, a precious commodity has been created. We need to save as much as we can. So it instigates the manufacture of insulin binding proteins in an attempt to capture insulin. However, for a transient period of time, there's IGF-1 that can also bind to that. So every time you run this process, you get a fleet of IGF-1s. Some go to muscle, some go to connective tissue, some go to binding proteins. And so every time you run this process, you're sort of charging this backup, this reserve, this time release mechanism. It's like seeding the clouds. And just like the weather, if you seed the clouds enough, eventually it rains. So what happens is every time you run this process, you add a little bit of IGF-1 to the binding proteins. Then slowly over time, the binding proteins decay because that's what proteins do. And every time they decay, they, at their own time course, will rain a little drip of IGF-1. Well, that little drip, run process over process over process, that little drip can become a downright downpour. So it almost becomes not when you do the whole GH to IGF-1 thing, it's that you do, and that you charge this reservoir, and then it becomes a sort of environment where there's just always a little bit of a drizzle. And so you actually are in control of creating that anabolic environment. Back when growth hormone was new, the early 90s, there was this mythos that the longer you took it, the better it worked. Well, it wasn't a bro science mythos. It was fucking true. The problem was just very few people could afford to get to that point. Now, at $1 an IU, everyone can get to that point.
I guess we always look at increasing binding proteins.
Correct. Which yet again is another reason. Well, I won't even go into the whole naturals yammering about their SHBG because that's a similar conversation, but a second one, and it'll make me yell and scream. So I won't do that to you. But it's also another reason why that whole, I woke up and my fasting glucose was 105 or whatever, 6 by your scale, 5.5, whatever the top of the scale is. And people freak out. That is exactly what you're buying. Literally, that's the goal. I don't know if it's the goal, but you're inputting a thing that's going to raise glucose. Raising glucose is going to raise insulin. Raising insulin is going to raise binding proteins. That's what you signed up for. If that isn't happening, I dare say you're shitting the bed.
Which I guess is why obviously we want, without getting fat, the most amount of carbohydrates in our diet. And also why the use of insulin, as you alluded to earlier, shouldn't be about a feel thing. It's more a constant action over time in the background, not, I put loads of weight on it. It's what they're actually doing to preserve magical IGF.
100%. And then if you take that logic of, Maximal carbohydrates means maximal insulin, it's binding proteins, and then you get this elevated blood glucose. Well, people immediately go, what about insulin resistance? And then I get on my little fucking box and I get up on top and I do the fucking cardio song. How the fuck do you combat insulin resistance? It's called cardiovascular fucking exercise. So you do the cardio. And then the weird thing is the cardio costs energy. So the energy that you burnt with the cardio, you eat in the carbs. So that is more carbs, which is more insulin, which is more binding proteins, which is more cardio. And it's a big fucking vicious cycle.
Before we wrap up, because I know you've got things to do and we can't keep you forever, since you've touched on insulin sensitivity,
Yep.
It's something that people they throw around a lot and they talk about it all the time. And I remember hearing you say something about it's probably more important than we realize in terms of the greatest bodybuilders to have ever lived were probably the ones that were more advantaged, that it just like their insulin sensitivity would just never diminish.
Correct. 100%. Almost universally you find. I'm going to throw a lot of names out, and to be fair, you find a lot of these names are people I don't like. So it's not like I'm name dropping buddies and pals. I'm name dropping observations. Universally, the best bodybuilders are people that could not have gotten fat if they tried. Arnold, Haney, they were skinny, non-round, not plump. They were Dave Palumbo, stopping drugs, stopping bodybuilding. Like, he's a tiny little man, but he's whipcord thin. Universally, the people that made the absolute best bodybuilders were people that had the lowest predisposition toward body fat, and therefore almost certainly that's a reference to the best insulin sensitivity.
So,
and if you think about what insulin sensitivity is, I'm sorry, but if you, again, it's one of those words where people just use it like, oh, insulin sensitivity, it comes out of everybody's mouth. How many people really take the time to look that up and understand exactly what that means? Real quick, super thumbnail. On the surface of a cell, well, never mind that. Let's go back to the very beginning. A cell, muscle cell, brain cell, doesn't matter. A cell is like a Ziploc bag, or I often joke, a breast implant. It's a complete enclosure. There's stuff inside that is separate from the stuff outside. It's a pouch. It's a sealed. Well, that's necessary to maintain the internal environment. But it's also a little bit of a problem because now you've got to get shit in and out, like food in and waste out. Because of that, there are surface structures. One of them is something called a GLUT4 translocator. Clever term for window. It's a window that can be opened. Next to GLUT4 translocator is an insulin receptor. Insulin floats around in the bloodstream, finds this surface. Ooh, it clicks in. When it clicks in, it then activates GLUT4 translocator. This is a very complicated story, and it's actually, when I said surface with rabbit ears, it's actually not on the surface. It's sort of near the surface, much like a submarine. A submarine somewhere under the water. And also metaphorically, the deeper it is, the longer it takes to surface. That is actually what insulin sensitivity is. When insulin clicks into the receptor and says, open the door, it's how far below the surface is the door. If your insulin sensitivity is poor, it means those receptors are very submerged. And if your insulin sensitivity is high, it means they're very superficial and they just sort of pop up, open, let shit in and out. And the thing largely that controls the depth of them is how frequently they have been asked to do their thing. Like the elevator analogy, it's how far away have you let the elevator get? If you demand activation of all this stuff regularly, the elevator never has a chance to get very far away. So it always comes pretty quick. But if you let it just, oh, fuck, I'm going to take 6 weeks off, the elevator could go all the way to the top floor. It's very far away and it's going to take time. That's exactly how this insulin sensitivity situation works. So the thing, you've got insulin, clicking in regularly. So that's a very regular response. So now the thing you need is regular exercise of the right variety and intensity to keep that receptor from getting away. Unfortunately, for most strength and body and physique athletes, that is actually cardiovascular fitness. Aerobic exercise is the thing largely that demands that door opening to get energy in to replete the exercise. So bad insulin sensitivity is essentially a euphemism for bad fitness. And good insulin sensitivity is essentially a euphemism for good fitness.
So you should do your cardio and not just have a day off carbs and eat some fats, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. The whole eat some fats thing, that'll make me scream and yell at, but another day. But yes, fitness is almost universally the missing element there. Again, think
Wonderful.
about this. Think about this. Bodybuilders love to think they're a snowflake. They're a special species that regular medicine has nothing to do with them. You hear it all the time. Like, oh, I don't talk about this stuff with my doctor because he doesn't understand what I do. Motherfucker, he went to medical school. I bet you he understands some shit. Like how your body works, how cells operate. I bet you. I mean, I don't seriously. So think about this. If you were diabetic, what's the universal you need to control your blood sugar? Yes, there's maybe a little less sugar, maybe a little more complex carbs, maybe a little bit more fiber, but universally, lower your body weight, raise your activity. Universally. Same species, different goal, same species. Weird how it carries over. Turns out that that's how people's work. Lower your body fat, raise your activity, and weird, those two things are kind of the same fucking thing. That's weird. So basically, it's just raise your fucking activity.
Yeah, no, I used to be one of those people that, and I used to say this all the time, that if you're trying to build muscle, doing cardio was like trying to fill the bath with a plug out, you know. And then obviously since over the years, my thinking is changing. I mean, you're gonna waste 200, 300 calories doing some cardio. It's a mouthful of food.
Exactly.
And now I've realized that how important like
Yeah.
physical sort of cardiovascular fitness is to actually progress and build a lot more muscle. So it stays all the time, and I've just become a better bodybuilder.
Right. For that 200 or 300 calorie expenditure, you get wicked longer runway in terms of insulin exposure and blood pressure regulation and all these things that usually are the roadblocks.
Yeah.
Again, roadblock. I keep going back to the same language. Roadblock, as in origin and destination, and then things you need to navigate around. One of the things you need to navigate around is a roadblock. So to plot the course around the roadblock is know that it's fucking there.
So thank you very much, Broderick, for this. Before we let you go, we've already touched on it, but I'm going to make you do a little bit more commercial whoring.
Oh, Jesus.
To advertise yourself, your services, and your website, which I've been a member of for a number of years, and I think it's a brilliant resource and one that not enough people know about. But I'll let you sort of explain.
Well, as unfortunately, as far as me as a resource, I'm book solid. I have no room for new clients, although I do have a good team around me who has some ability to take on new clients. So that is still sort of on the table. The free public website is teamevilgsp.com. Through that website, you can contact myself and team members. And then the members resource is members.teamevilgsp.com. By the way, you can access that through the free site. And there we have a 4-pay site, $20 a month US, $200 a year US. And I'm really terrible at espousing the wonders of it, but everything I spoke about here today, I don't think I'm exaggerating, hundreds of hours on every one of those topics. We actually took the time. We're in the process of upgrading said website. And one of the things we needed to do is inventory what the fuck's on it. There is 1,200 hours of Q&A on our members website. 1,200 hours. That's ludicrous. I didn't realize that I was capable of talking that fucking much, as well as content specific talks about GH, talks about growth hormone, talks about course design, talks, as well as print content. Lots of abstracts, articles, talking about assorted studies, lots and lots of content. By the way, and I try to emphasize this more and more, not just for myself. Team Evil GSB is now, in fact, a full team, and we have content from many, many different vectors.
And I will also add to that when you do join the website, you also get to join the Facebook group,
Correct.
which gives you access to ask some questions in there to some very smart people, but also on a weekly basis, Broderick does a Q&A where you can literally interact in real time and ask questions. And
correct.
If it's a good question, you get a good answer, and otherwise you can have a piss ripped out here, which is brilliant to watch. It's knowledge and entertainment.
Yeah, actually, that's a joke. We think we've created a new segment in the market where we're now edutainment.
Yeah, I mean, I love the Q&As; they're brilliant. But I think a lot of, when you just lay there in bed at night and you get a question that you need the answer to, Google's no good, but then you can literally put it in there any point during the week and it'll get answered.
Correct.
And I think that's almost, if you can't actually get to watch the Q&A live, you'll still get your question answered and be able to watch it back the next day or whenever, doing your cardio, things like that. And I think that's an invaluable tool. I've learned so much from those Q&As. So we will wrap everything up there because you've got things to do. So thank you very much for your time, Broderick.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Huge
Easy
thanks.
conversation with folks like yourselves.
Thank you.